Hi, my name is Macy Rowe, and today I'll be discussing my Bio 263 independent project about hummingbird behavior in relation to food sources. The purpose of this lab was to observe the behavior of hummingbirds to see if they would be more drawn to nectar from flowers, or when given the opportunity, more drawn to sugar water. Additionally, the concentration of sugar in the sugar water hummingbird feeder was lessened halfway through the experiment. This way, it would be observed if this factor had any influence on the number of visitations to certain areas. Hummingbirds, scientifically known as Charlichidae, are solitudinous small birds that are found mostly in the Western Hemisphere and near the equatorial belt. Though only some species venture to North America, these hummingbirds spend the winter season in Central America and Mexico, then begin to migrate north to their breeding grounds in the southern United States around February. Due to this migration pattern, during the warmer months of spring and summer in Southern California, the population of hummingbirds increases tremendously. Flowers that tend to attract a hummingbird are ones that are long and tubular to permit their narrow beak and tongue, have a high concentration of sugar, about 26%, and are brightly colored with orange and red hues. These pollinators tend to defend certain territories and are quite competitive because the nectar in the flowers takes time for the plant to produce. In one experiment by scientists Rachel McCaffrey and Susan Wethington, they studied the effect that hummingbird feeders had on the pollinator-plant relationships in close proximity. The results infer that the sugar water hummingbird feeders were more frequently visited in the season where there was a lack of flowering plants. However, in this experiment, there was abundance of flowers, and the preference of natural food over the sugar water was tested without the influential seasonal factor. In another experiment by scientist Thomas Wheeler, he tested one theory that hummingbirds can remember the location of consistent food sources. His results infer that hummingbirds will frequently visit locations of nectar that they have located previously. The hypothesis under experimentation was if the sugar water hummingbird feeder would be more frequently visited than the flowering plants, and if the amount of sugar in the feeder would affect these results in any way. The prediction was that there will be more visitation to the sugar water hummingbird feeder than the hibiscus plant, because the sugar water is a more attainable source of food and the location remains consistent. Additionally, the higher concentration of sugar in the water, the more hummingbirds will visit. The experimental period began on April 26th and lasted until May 23rd. During these 4 weeks, the behaviors of hummingbirds were observed for the same duration at the same time of day, from 4 to 4:45 p.m. However, this time of day was only chosen for consistency, and other time periods can be used as long as one is consistent. For the most accurate results, it was important that the observer remained in a similar spot each time to avoid being a factor in the results. It was also essential that they were able to view both areas equally well. First, the hummingbird feeder was placed in one area where it could be undisturbed by human interference. This hummingbird feeder was filled with sugar water that was made by mixing 1 cup of refined white sugar and 3 cups of boiling water in a bowl until all of the sugar was completely dissolved, and then it was allowed to cool. Then, in the final 2 weeks, only ½ a cup of the refined white sugar was used. It is essential that one does not put any red food dye or any food colorings into the hummingbird feeder, as this can be harmful to the birds. Also, the colored dye may actually have an influence on how the birds are attracted to the feeder and could be an unwanted factor. Before the birds were examined at all, the feeder was left for exactly 24 hours in the position it would be observed. This was done so that consistency and location of the feeder in relation to the hibiscus plant would not be a factor to take into account. Then it was observed how many hummingbirds drank the sugar water from the feeder as opposed to the ones who drank from the flowers. To keep all variables consistent, it was ensured that the observers stayed far enough away from the location of the observed zone so that their presence would not be a factor in how many hummingbirds drank from the feeder or the flowers. As you can see in this video, we got some footage of the hummingbird drinking from the feeder. As you can see, it goes to different locations to feed, and I believe this is some instinctual pollinator habits. And then again here you see the same thing, except now we have 2 hummingbirds and you can see the territorial instincts. So in the first week, the average number of hummingbirds to the feeder was about 5.57 birds, while the average number of birds to the feeder was only 2.86. In week 2, the average amount of birds to the feeder increased about 5.71, while the hibiscus plant had an average of only about 5.14 birds. When the sugar concentration decreased, the average number of hummingbirds to the feeder decreased to an average of about 2 in week 3, and in week 4 to about 1.57. The hibiscus plant had average visitation numbers about 4.71 and 5.29 respectively for those 2 weeks. These results can be seen in Figure 1. The scatter plot shows the total number of hummingbird visits to the different food sources during each week of the experimentation. And in Figure 2, you can see the difference in the number of visitations by the sugar concentration in the water to the feeder. As you can see in Figure 2, with the higher level of sugar, there were more visitations. So based on the results seen over the past month, the average hummingbird visitations to the feeder in the first 2 weeks with a normal sugar concentration level increased immensely over time, and the total number actually doubled. However, the number of visitations to the hibiscus plant remained fairly consistent. When the sugar concentration was changed in the feeder, there was a significant decrease in the number of visitations. And by week 2 of this low concentration, there were days where actually no hummingbirds drank from the feeder at all. Overall, the number of birds that visited the hibiscus plant over this 45-minute period each day was generally unvarying over the entirety of the 4 weeks, regardless of the concentration of sugar in the hummingbird feeder. In week 2, the average number of hummingbirds that visited the feeder was higher than the average number that chose to drink nectar from the hibiscus flowers, and my hypothesis before the experiment was conducted was that the sugar water hummingbird feeder would be more frequently visited than the flowering plant, regardless of the sugar concentration. It was predicted that this would occur because the feeder is a more consistent, easier source of food. However, after observing the results of this experiment, it can be inferred that the concentration of sugar in the water had an influence on the visitation of the birds to the feeder, but the hibiscus plant visiting numbers were far more consistent over the time period. These numbers may have been more accurate had the experiment been run for a longer period of time, because perhaps the longer period of time, the feeder and the flowering plant would have become more parallel in their numbers. In a similar experiment between scientists Jennifer S.E. Garrison and Clifton Lee Gass, they observed how a change in the source and supply of nectar affected the hummingbirds' behavior, and they too saw a pattern of the birds going to a higher sugar concentration more frequently. So, based on their experimentation, it can be inferred that hummingbirds can determine the location of different food sources and may even be able to remember the location of consistent sources. Some other errors that may have occurred with the experiment are that the observer may have somehow not been able to see 1 or 2 of the bird visitations to either the feeder or the plant. Also, if one were to repeat the experiment or observe the birds over a longer period of time, or maybe even longer time increments during the day, maybe they could have had more accurate results. Additionally, it would be interesting to somehow be able to kind of mark or tag the birds for accuracy, and you could even maybe visualize their territorial boundaries, see how many individual birds visit, rather than simply implying the number of times that a hummingbird visited the plant or the feeder. In conclusion, I'd just like to acknowledge my peer review partners. It was great to receive your constructive criticism, and it was awesome to be able to revise my project over the past couple of weeks. And here's my literature cited. Thank you so much.